Ladies and gentlemen, Luke Johnson, Bob Schut, I believe is today our 17th installment.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So we're going to be talking about Kierkegaard's works of love, and it is Bob's turn to teach me. All right, Bob, get to it.
Okay, jumping right in. I found this particular section here, maybe the last few sections, a little bit different than most of his other writings, Luke. I found him these almost like bullet items, like he's writing as he's thinking, rather than the storytelling kind of Kierkegaard that were associated with in some of his other works. I find it doesn't flow as smoothly for me, and it's a little more difficult to understand because of that. Did you find these sections similar to that? Less storytelling and a little bit more like the bullet items, like one would write down as one writes when they think?
Well, bullet items to me would indicate that there'd be a little bit more structure to it. I see this as being a little, it seems like it's sort of flowing out of him. So I would say it's not as structured as we typically find his writing. But I don't want to give people the impression that it's not worth reading, because there's something about kind of that sort of expression that can be more rewarding than the more organized, coherent narrative that someone will present to us. So as much as I found these sections to be a bit of a struggle, I don't find them unrewarding.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah, I didn't want to imply that. But what I find he does is he'll say something, he'll mention something, and then he just doesn't follow through with that, and then maybe a page or two later, he follows through with it. So it's kind of like he thought about it, and then he decided, well, yeah, now it's time for me to get down to it, and I'll explain what that was. But you kind of have to wait. So for those people that are reading him, don't be surprised if you get the sense like, I'm lost. I don't know where he's going, because sometimes you just got to read the whole thing in order to get it.
I'm trusting that he's building towards something. So what's the specific section that we're going to be looking at today?
Okay, it's section 3. It's called Love Hopes All Things and Yet Is Never Put to Shame. And in my copy, it starts on 231. I think our pages are in sync now. I think you probably start on 231 too, or very close to that. But he begins with the quotation, and he's been quoting 1 Corinthians chapter 13 all along here about love. And here he's at verse 7. He says, and it begins with, it bears all things, but we know what he means is love. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And here he's going to focus on the idea of love hopes all things. So it gets a little bit difficult. So hopefully between you and me, we can kind of iron some of this out a little bit. He talks about the importance of Scripture. He says, Holy Scripture seeks to give our earthly existence a form of festivity and dignity by relating us to the eternal, creating a relationship between us and the eternal. And this is, I think, a theme that's good. He presents it here, but I think it's good to see this in Kierkegaard's other works as well, because he talks a lot about the eternal. And whether we think he's referring either directly to God or indirectly to God, or perhaps to the kingdom of God, maybe in different contexts, it may mean all of the above. But he's always trying to focus us towards the eternal. This is a different context for us sometimes, because we tend to see things in this temporal world. And he says that temporality skulks along loiteringly, but so fast that one never becomes aware that it's vanishing and that one is running out of time. And this is the idea he's trying to get across here, that time can sometimes appear to go so slowly that we become focused upon the moment, and we lose the vision because we fall away from the eternal. So it's kind of an interesting idea that, and I think this tends to be true, that sometimes, and in some religions, I believe Buddhism, the idea is to focus on the moment. And we talk a lot about that. But with Kierkegaard, he's kind of telling us the other way around. He's saying, well, yeah, the moment happens, but you have to focus on the eternal in order to understand the context of the moment.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And he talks about in Christianity, we get refreshed every day. He says, and can place our minds back on the eternal. So he's kind of crediting Christianity for having that quality, not to focus so much on that moment, to include that moment, but to focus on the eternal. And every day to refresh that idea, to remind us every day of the eternal. So when we pray, when we worship, even when we study Scripture, we should always keep that in mind, that this is all done in the context of the eternal, not in the moment of the temporal. Some religions try to focus on the present, but according to Kierkegaard, this takes one's focus from the eternal. So for Kierkegaard, this means away from God and man's relationship to him. So when we get caught up in the moment, it can sometimes take us away from our relationship with the eternal, which tends to lessen our relationship with God himself. He speaks of sowing and reaping. He speaks of this sowing and reaping as relating to our earthly existence and our heavenly existence. And this is the idea where he says the temporal joins together with the eternal. So he's saying that even though they're different activities, sowing and reaping, they're joined by a common goal. The planting takes place in hope, while reaping takes place in actuality. One is done for the future, with the future in mind, and the other with the present in mind. So it's kind of clever how he puts together sowing and reaping, which is very biblical terms here.
Oh, yeah.
Sowing is done in the immediate. It's done now. But the reaping, we've got to wait for. It's kind of a future event. But they join together because one causes the other. Okay?
Right. This goes back, I think, of all the parables, such as the separating the wheat from the tares.
Yeah. There's so many. And so he kind of throws this in here, not really as a parable as much as a kind of a simile, maybe. But then he switches over to tribulation. He says that Christianity seems like it's filled with tribulation and striving all the time, yet the eternal life of victory. The temporal is filled with tribulation, but the eternal will eventually bring us to victory and salvation. I think tribulation a lot of times tribulation is pretty much a hot word today. A lot of people, as we were talking about earlier, expect the rapture pretty soon and tribulation either before or after. But tribulation becomes a big term here, the suffering for and of the faith. And he presents it here, that even though there's a lot of suffering and tribulation involved, in eternity, if we see things in the context of eternity, we see all of this bringing us to victory and salvation. I kind of liked how he presented that idea. Helps, I think, people to get through the temporal world of suffering, because we all go through it mentally, physically, in one way or the other. And so I think this puts that eternal context on our suffering, that we have to see the end plot, the end of the plot. What's going to happen, we're going to be saved. That's the most important thing. What
do you think, if, just to give some real-life correlates, what do you think the tribulation looks like for individuals? Like when we're going through trials and tribulations in this temporal life,
yes,
what that looks like if we're not being expressly persecuted? Just to draw it out a little bit more.
Okay.
Right? Like someone say, okay, Luke and Bob, they're a couple of Christian dudes that live in America. Like they've got these imagined boogeymen that they think are out to get them all the time or something like that.
Yeah.
But if we were to talk to non-believers and talk about what the real tribulation is in this here life, how would we describe that? Is it trying to get people to take the eternal perspective seriously and having them being completely dead to it and feeling like that we can't relate to the world? Is it feeling like we're in some sort of spiritual prison here on earth, that really we fell from a higher place and we feel like we're serving time? I mean, what does that tribulation look like in regards to temporality and eternality?
Well, I would say if they want an example, they should go out into the world and preach the truth about Christianity, because you're going to get bombarded from the world and you're going to get bombarded from the church, perhaps. Not all churches, but some churches. You're going to get it from both sides. There's kind of a...
And that truth of Christianity specifically, you mean the exclusivity of salvation through Jesus Christ, because this is an offensive message that the world does not want to hear.
Yes. So when you do that, it brings about... And I'm not necessarily, but it's inclusive of physical punishment, physical tribulation as well. But there's a tormenting, I think, that goes on within the believer that is so difficult, because you have to cross so many lines, and you have to deal with people who will try to make a laughing stock of you, or will just totally reject you, just don't believe what you're trying to tell them. And this is a kind of tribulation that I think happens to many Christians who are... The more truth you preach, the more tribulation I think you're going to have to endure. It may not be physical. People are coming and at my front door and trying to get me and kidnap me or anything like that. I'm in no physical danger. But there's a torment that I think that we all go through when we try to preach the truth, as we see it, of course. But
do you think so? Like the skeptical person, and I don't mean to get too off track here, but just to give equal time, the skeptical person would be like, well, what you're describing sounds like what anyone who believes they have sole possession of the truth would go through. That if you were to talk to someone who's trying to evangelize about being a Hare Krishna or being an advocate for Islam, or that they too would go through a similar sort of tribulation. I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is there something special about the sort of tribulation that Christians would experience?
Well, I think the message is very different. I think for me the message is not that I have the truth, but and I never preach that. I preach that Christ is the truth. That's what Christ claimed. I believe it. I preach that. Christ is the truth, and I don't have it, but I offer it to others. I participate in it more than have it. And yes, there's going to be persecution for any kind of religion. So it's not by persecution that we can really always judge the truth, because there's always imitations. And you can go and preach the most slanderous thing and be persecuted for it, and that doesn't make the slander true.
Right.
So there's more to it than just the persecution. So just to let anybody know, it's not just because we suffer persecution that makes it true. It's that because it is true, we suffer persecution.
I think it's a fair distinction for you to say that you're not in possession of the truth. I think that is a fair distinction to make, but obviously it requires greater meditation. But we should move on to other topics.
Okay. When we bring things into the context of the world, everything is brought into a noisy, confused commotion. Christianity brings things into a better context. This is because it puts things into the context of the eternal rather than the temporal. So the world is filled with confusion, noise, and commotion, according to Kierkegaard.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Especially today, like we were talking about earlier, how much more confused can it get? Anyway, Christianity is supposed to, the truth. I mean, when we say Christianity, what he's speaking about is the true Christianity, Okay, and whatever my person might want to think that is, but we'll put that into the context of the true Christianity. When he talks about Christendom, he's talking about the imitation of Christianity. But right now, he's talking exclusively about true Christianity. It puts things into a better context, which is the context of the eternal, not the context of the temporal. This is why a lot of times people are so, as we'll find out, live in fear. They're in fear because they live in the temporal. They see things as happening today, right now, and creates fear. What we have to do is project, extend our hope into the eternal. And this is what it's all about today. That's really what we're going to talk about today, extending hope into the eternal. So this is so important in understanding Kierkegaard. The eternal is spoken of in a sense kind of like it's the kingdom of God. It's where God exists and where man hopes to exist in the future. So now, is there really dignity in the world? Is what he's going to address here. Even if a person wins dignity in this world, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean anything? Since it's only for a short period of time, and you know how the world is with dignity, it kind of changes moment by moment. One time you're a dignified individual, and the next time you're, what would you call them? Just
you're in the gutter, or whatever the situation is.
You're a bozo, you're a laughing stock.
Right. You can be a prolific running back for a football team, and then you can be driving a car down the interstate with helicopters chasing you.
Yeah, that sounds like a good movie. And consider consider those who bestow the honor upon us. So it's not just the honor that we get, but just, he says, for a moment, just consider the people who are honoring you. What good is an honor given to us if it's given by people of dubious reputation? So another thing to consider. Medals, trophies, awards of any kind. What good is it if the people that are giving it to you really aren't upstanding people? It reminds me of the idea that we have to give trophies to all the teams and to everybody simply because they participate rather than to the winner, because we don't want to offend anybody. So what's the significance of a trophy when you give it to everybody? So not...
Well, sometimes, what's interesting is there's been a little bit of attack where medals and trophies and plaques are given to people for what they hope they will achieve. And we saw that, look, I don't do politics, all right, but what was very interesting is that I believe shortly after Barack Obama became president, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. Is that correct? Let me look into that. But he hadn't actually been, I don't think he'd been president for a significant period of time, but he ended up getting a Peace Prize. I think the expectation, don't go and do your own research. Okay. Don't trust me. I think the expectation was that he was going to somehow correct the foreign policy errors of George Bush, and the international community wanted to incentivize him to do that. But don't take my word for it. Let me check that out.
A fine line between expectation and anticipation. So we'll see. Christianity doesn't bring us to some lofty place, he tells us, but it gives us hope in the eternal, that Christ is the way. So our hope is in the eternal as we hope for Christ. This is a key element of hope. Now, something I think was pretty interesting here, Luke. On page 233, I'm going to read this quote here. Christianity's hope is the eternal, and Christ is the way. His abasement is the way. But also when he ascended into heaven, he was the way. Now, I remember one time you and I discussed the idea that Kierkegaard never mentioned the resurrection. And critics would talk about the fact he never mentions the resurrection. Well, here he mentions the ascension, which is just a hair's difference. You you really can't ascend unless you are resurrected. So I find that kind of interesting. Maybe we can kind of put that down in our little notebooks, that there was a place where he talks about Christ and the resurrection by implying the ascension. Would you agree with that, or am I just trying to stretch the point a little too thin?
I want you to repeat it because I wanted to fact check myself on this thing that I just claimed. Barack Obama received the Peace Prize less than a year after taking office.
Okay.
So,
I never questioned you for a minute, Luke.
Okay. so can you just say that?
I will. Page 233. It says, Christianity's hope is the eternal, and Christ is the way. His abasement is the way. But also when he ascended into heaven, he was the way.
Well.
Did I find a pearl here? Did I find a pearl?
Yeah, I finally we get something about Jesus Christ's ascension. But what's interesting about that, do we know anyone else who ascended in the Bible?
No, I don't think we know anybody who ascended into the Bible.
Well, we know. What about Enoch and Elijah? Did they not ascend?
They were. Let's see. What's the word that they used for that? Do you remember the word that they used for that? They were translated. Translated.
They walked with God, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, what I'm trying to say here is, were Enoch or Elijah killed before they translated?
Well, it doesn't say that they were.
No. So, I mean, it seems like they were able to escape death and be translated. So all I'm really saying here is, just because Kierkegaard mentions Jesus' ascension, that doesn't necessarily mean that he believed. I'm pretty sure he believes that Jesus was resurrected, but it is very interesting that he doesn't emphasize it more.
Yeah,
because
he does say something here to the effect that I think would be give us a clue that he believes something happened to Christ, that he was ascended into heaven. So,
right.
So I think he's giving us a little bit of a clue. So Kierkegaard goes on, and love is greater than faith and hope. So if one loves, one also hopes and has faith. So these qualities of faith and hope are subsumed in the quality of love. He presents love as being greater in the sense that it contains both faith and hope. Again, another key issue for understanding what Kierkegaard means when he says love. And I think that love also kind of takes into consideration many other things as well, besides faith and hope. But I think he's kind of on the right track. Love hopes all things, yet is never put to shame. Okay, so he's going to talk about shame a little bit. He gets a little bit difficult to follow here when we talk about shame, but hopefully we can untangle it here, Luke. He reminds us that hoping does not mean that someone might not be put to shame. We will examine this in more detail later, I put in my notes. Because here's one of those examples where he brings up this idea of shame and hope, and then he drops it. And then he talks about something else, and then he brings it back up later on in much more detail. To hope all things is the opposite of despair, which is hoping nothing at all. It's the loss of all hope. It's an interesting way to define despair in the negative. What it isn't. Despair is to not hope, to lose all hope. To hope all things is the same as to hope always. It's composed of both the eternal and the temporal. So we got to think about this a little bit. To hope all things is the same as to hope always, or to always hope. So hope is related to the temporal as the future because it has possibility. So now he kind of migrates a little bit further here, that hope connects, which is what he says. In this manner, he says it touches both the temporal and the eternal. So hope touches it because hope is something we project into the future. And the future somehow touches the eternal. The past is actuality, and the future is possibility. And the eternal is possibility in time. So these are kind of like little things you kind of have to meditate on quite a while to grasp what he's telling us here. Probably have to play this over again a few times. I have to think here not so much about time in the sense of hours and minutes here, but in the sense of the concept of time. Time limits us to the temporal. And when we think of the future, we can extend that outwards or extend it out towards the infinite. But I think it still keeps us within the sphere of time. I think we can think of the future and kind of think about the future going on forever, but we can't quite get there. He says they touch each other, but I think only conceptually, in the same way that in mathematics we speak about the infinite. Yeah. The infinite really isn't a number that actually gets to the infinite. It's only conceptually in the infinite, because you can always add one more number on to whatever number you have. So it never really connects physically to the infinite, but it connects conceptually. So I don't know if you would agree with that idea, but in order to make that...
Oh yeah, I mean, talking about theories of time is something that, man, I would love for us to look at Timaeus or something like that at some point. But I have an interesting question from you from a Bible scholar perspective. Is something I notice when I read the Bible is that I hear about this millennial day idea that, you know, that there are these every day is like 1,000 years for God, and on the seventh day he rested, and then there's not really like an eighth day. There's just like, supposedly when we talk biblical eschatology, there's just like endlessness because the millennial kingdom has occurred or whatever. There's not a 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th day or anything like that. I wonder if there just comes a point where temporality and eternality just sort of merge into a form of endlessness, where they're not these parallel things that are running alongside one another, that are superimposed upon one another, that the timelines actually merge in some way to give rise to where temporality just totally falls away and there's nothing but endlessness. Do you know anything about what I'm talking about?
Well, the seventh day is eternal. The seventh day is eternal with God. It never ends. If you read Genesis, you'll find out that seventh day begins but never ends. So he's speaking here about something. The scriptures are telling us something. Of course, in our physical reality, we repeat the week, first through the seventh day. And on the seventh day, we rest, which was a Saturday for the Jew. And it was given for that reason, and it was repetitious, cyclical. It was to teach us something, that the seventh day was a day of rest. And every year you get this lesson over and over and over again, God telling us the seventh day you rest, the seventh day you rest. Jesus comes along, and Paul, I think it was in Hebrews, it may have been someplace else, we find out that Christ brings the seventh day to us, which means he brings the day of rest to us, which means the cycle has ended. We are in the infinite day of rest, spiritually speaking. We rest from our works.
So if I understand you correctly, the point of taking the Sabbath seriously and keeping it holy is that it gives us some idea of what endlessness and eternal peace with God will be like.
Yes.
Because this is the thing, is like me as sort of like this baby Christian compared to Bob, is that like, you know, there's a lot of things with the Bible I don't understand, but you know, like if God says to rest, I guess I should, because like he's a lot smarter than me. He's a lot wiser than me. And like my human frame, my human ambition wants me to just like, yeah, I'm on the clock all the time. Like it's actually very hard for me to not work. That's a big problem for me. So I'm trying to force myself to to get in line with the Bible in this particular aspect, and I never really understood why. But talking to you right now, I mean, it seems like that's pretty plausible to remind us of what being with God would actually be like.
Yes. We probably have been misled a little bit about this day of rest also. It's not a day off. It's not a holiday for us to just take a day off. The Sabbath is a day to keep holy. We rest from our labors, but it's a day that we must keep the Sabbath holy. That means keep it dedicated to God, which for the Jews, that's what they did on the Sabbath. It wasn't the priests didn't rest. That was a big day of work for the priests, as Jesus points out, because they had to do all the things that keeps the Sabbath holy. And that's the contradiction that Jesus is trying to bring up to the Pharisees when he talks about them. If it's a day of rest, then why did the Pharisees keep working? He says, as long as God works, I work, is what Jesus was teaching them. So the idea is more what Jesus did in working was not the opposite of resting, but it was true rest, which was to keep the Sabbath holy. So what Jesus did, what his works were works of holiness. So
he was healing people and ministering to people.
That's right. So to heal a person was that work? Of course it was. But more so than work, it was holiness. And that's what we have to understand in our lives. It's not honoring God by not working. It's honoring God by keeping it holy. Every day from here on out, when you become a Christian, every day is the Sabbath, so every day you must keep it holy. So that's the ultimate lesson that we learn from Christ. We're now in the day of holiness, the day of the Sabbath. So keep yourselves holy.
Did someone write a book about this? Do I have a good friend that wrote a book about this topic?
Maybe.
And can't they find it on Amazon? It's called Kingdom in Your Midst.
I think they still can, and unless it's been banned by Amazon. But so far, I think it's still there. Yeah. I tried to cover that because I found that to be a point misunderstood by many people. I don't even want to say misunderstood, just not ever made. So many people are so confused about the Sabbath and the laws that I thought it was worth a whole chapter. But maybe there's more to be written. Maybe the books aren't finished yet. We'll see.
I've been thinking about it.
I hope. Okay, let's talk about expectation now. We speak about it. A person expects something. When we expect the good, we speak of it as hope. And when we expect evil, it's called fear. Here he's giving us both sides of possibility. Very interesting. So when the expectation is tied into possibility, what could possibly happen today? It could be something good. Well, then we hope something good happens. But it could be something really bad. Well, I fear it happens. We don't say, boy, I hope today something really bad happens to me, right? That would be hope. We don't mix the two. So he defines it here as depending upon what the expectation is, as defining hope versus fear. The possibility of good is called hope, and the possibility of good is also eternal, since the eternal is good. Of course, this is a presupposition, Luke, that eternity is going to be good. What if one presupposed that eternity was bad? Then possibility would only have one outcome, and that would be fear. True?
Well, can we presuppose that it could be both? Right? I mean, do we have to choose?
If we did have to choose.
If we did have to, right. If we had to choose, but I mean, the Bible tells us, and this is not necessarily what maybe Kierkegaard is saying, the Bible tells us that eternity works in both directions.
Yeah.
or at least my understanding of it is. I mean, I'm not a trained theologian like Bob, but it's not just that eternity is granted to. It seems to be layered, and it seems to be different. It seems to have. There just seems to be different types of it.
Well, and it's true that one could hope for it to be good, only to discover it isn't so good for them because they didn't take the proper precautions.
Right.
So we could get caught up in a false hope.
Right.
Yes, very true.
Yeah.
I'm glad we talked about that. That's an interesting point. Then he says that the one who hopes can never be deceived on the basis of the possibility of that the good is eternal. In other words, good will win in the end. But I think that's kind of interesting what we just brought up. One could be deceived into thinking things are good and discover that they didn't take the proper precautions. So we have to see how that fits in here. But,
well, this is what the world teaches, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is why this feeds into like the tribulation aspect of trying to present the truth of Christianity to the world at large. I think the world at large has kind of a fairy tale understanding of what religion is, where, if you're generally a good person, like you'll like you'll go to the pearly gates, and there'll be a big file on you and how you lived your life, and they're like, yeah, you shoplifted here and there, but you also gave blood, so it cancels out. Come on in.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the general conception everyone typically has about it, or that we're all sort of climbing the mountain together.
Yeah, I think we call that universalism now, which is a big trend here that everybody's right, everybody's going to enter into the kingdom of heaven, so how dare you say Christ is the only way? It's a very appealing conception of the way things might work, right? Like, it runs into a conflict, though. Does that mean Satanism is right, and you can get to God through Satanism?
Well, I think the Satanists, the thing is with Satanism is that, they consider themselves to be very ethical human beings.
Yeah, they may give that appearance. But what about atheists? Can atheism get you into the kingdom of heaven? I mean, as someone who has many atheist friends, I think they think, well, if there is a God, I think he'll have mercy on me because my deeds will be weighed good. Yeah, well.
But they don't believe there's I'm not God. I'm not going to sit here and judge or anything like that, but I think this is what it's up against, right? This is what I'm trying. This is the message of the real gospel versus what the world wants to believe, and could be a potential false hope that leads to perdition. So I don't know how it's going to work, and I'm not going to sit here and proclaim. I know what the Bible says. I see the sense that the secular world and the vaguely religious world says, but I said this is the tension. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. No, and that's why we bring it up now. This is the place to bring it up in an educational format so we can discuss it. But I'm going to quote from Romans 8:28 here from the King James Bible. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. So, for those of us who believe that we are Christians and that we are called to be Christians according to his purpose, and we believe that all things will work out for good because we love God. Why? Because we enter into eternity with hope. We enter into the eternal possibility with the hope for God's goodness. And so we believe in the end of the story, at the end of the movie, it works out right for all of us.
I've been thinking about something. I had this is quite a massive theological question, and I don't expect you to be able to answer it in its totality right now. But it occurred to me this past week, and would you mind just taking a quick stab at it?
Do I get more than 3 words this time to answer?
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you if Jesus was a time traveler.
Okay.
I think it's well established that Jesus was a time traveler. But tying all these different themes together of different timelines and endlessness and eternality and all things working for good, and there being even possible layers to eternality, right, where individuals could be shunted between them. I mean, we see, I believe it's in Ephesians, right, where Jesus descends into Sheol and he saves the Old Testament saints so they can ascend with him, right? We seem to have this hyperdimensional reality in the Christian paradigm that we don't often talk about in churches, but I think it's highly fascinating. You know, we have it seems like we've got, Abraham's bosom within the larger underworld situation of 3 tiers, and then earth, and then 3 heavens. But if there is endlessness, if there is eternality, and there is a situation where the timelines actually merge, where God comes down to earth again, where the kingdom comes down, is there a situation that God could ultimately save all humanity, given enough time? Like, I think, just if we were to, I know you're an amillennialist and stuff like that, but, if there were an actual tribulation period, it seems like that might be something where there would be tribulation saints, and that God would come again to talk directly to the Jewish people. And if there is a millennial reign, it seems like something different will occur there that I don't even know about. But could God eventually come back for all his sheep and try to meet them where they are? It's kind of in a weird sort of futuristic partial universalism. I'm not trying to lull people in any sort of stupor, but do you see any evidence for that? Or is it like, nah, figure it out now or you're going to burn?
Oh, I can answer that in one word: no.
Which question?
Let me elaborate now.
Okay.
God gives people opportunity. It's up to it's his timeline. He gives us as long as he feels we need. And I have no idea what goes through God's mind as to why some people live to be 105 and other people die in the womb. I have no idea. Not something I can ever answer. But time isn't the essence of faith. Because faith is not a product of human will. The longer we have, if God does things to us to produce faith, it either produces faith or it produces hatred. People will shake their hands. Why did you do this to me, God? You're tormenting me. And God is saying, I'm trying to bring you to faith by showing you the truth about the world you live in. But if you don't believe, then you take this truth as an act of God's hatred towards us. I had millions and millions of dollars, and now I lost it in the stock market. God, I hate you. This is your fault. You did this to me. You see what I mean? Without faith, you don't perceive the things of faith. So faith is a gift of God, and it has nothing to do with time. The longer we're here on earth, the more faithful we could be, but the longer we live on earth, the more unfaithful we could be. So I hope that addresses or brings up more questions.
It does. I just was kind of just thinking in terms of biblical eschatology. It seems like, I think about in the book of Revelation how there are these 2 witnesses that come back to minister during the period of Jacob's trouble, and it seems like there's the
and what happens to the 2 witnesses? Do you remember what happens to the 2 witnesses?
Well, ultimately they're ministering and they're breathing fire right out of their mouths, and then they're killed, and then they're resurrected and they ascend.
Thank you.
Right?
And they're killed because they're preaching the truth. The people don't say to them, thank you for coming in the tribulation and saving us from all this horror. The tribulation didn't help them, many of them anyway, at all. Only some will come from the tribulation.
it just seems that if we're looking at different dispensations and things like that, that God has a different way of talking to humanity. And I think the larger question I said is there a way that God could ultimately save every soul? And maybe just to dramatize it even more, can God save Lucifer? Will that could, in the ultimate final thing, could God ultimately...
Hey, God provides everything we need for salvation. Okay? If we don't take it, it isn't God's fault. And if Lucifer decides to repent, I can't imagine why God would not, but that's not going to happen because it can't happen. But if anybody confesses and repents, yes, God will save them because that's what God does. He provides Christ. He doesn't force Christ down our throats. Otherwise, everybody would be saved right now.
Right.
But we're not, because we have to accept it and act in faith. So
that was a pretty crazy set of questions, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, but
it's good.
Gives us an opportunity to think outside the box, right?
Yeah. Enjoy the ride, people.
Yeah.
I think if anybody's followed us down this rabbit hole this far, if they're on part 17, I think they're with us for the long run.
Yeah, just tighten your seatbelts a little bit. Okay. Sometimes we speak of hope, but we're really speaking of desire, longing, and expectancy. True hope depends upon the possibility of the good. So he says that, before I go on to the next one, let's stay here for a minute. He says, sometimes we speak of hope. We call it hope, but we're actually speaking about our desire, our longing, our expectancy. Now, he doesn't say it here, I don't think, but what he's talking about, the temporal, being in the temporal world. We say, man, I hope the stock market goes up. Okay, I hope, my next card is an ace. I hope these things. That's not hope, he said. That's desire. That's longing to have something. I hope she's going to love me, I hope I grow into a 6'1" man, handsome. That's not hope. That's a longing for, a desire, an expectation. True hope depends on the possibility of the good. So he's trying to just further define what hope is. And hope is nothing at all about us profiting. It's about the possibility of good, becoming good. He says that when we get older, our lives fall into a repetition. Well, I guess between the two of us, I could probably speak better to that. Right, Luke?
I don't know, Bob. Your life is pretty spontaneous compared to me. You may be twice my age, but I think you're. I mean, you could be base jumping, and I'm just like, just at the mill, just grinding away.
Well, I think this tends to be true, though. Anyway, I think the older we get, the more we fall into repetition. We feel safe and confident in the things that have proven themselves to be helpful and safe. Routine also helps us to function more efficiently. So, yeah, I agree with him here. I think the older we get, it doesn't mean we can't step out once in a while into something new. I do tend to do that, maybe more than most people in my age bracket, which is still a secret. I think there's one video we did where I gave my age, but I don't know if that's going to happen again. We'll see. Anyone?
I'm living through you. That's I enjoying life vicariously.
Okay. Well, I think
via Bob Schut.
Yeah, you say that I'm twice your age, so that probably gives them a little bit of a clue. So, okay.
I'm 15.
Thank you.
I'm a boy genius.
Doogie Howser, huh? Okay. Anyone who lives without possibility is in despair because he breaks with the eternal. He's lost hope of the expectation of the good. He creates an end where there is no need for an end. This is really good. I really enjoyed this little piece he says here. If you live without possibility, you're in despair because you break with the eternal. So he's making a connection between possibility, despair, and the eternal. So when you have no hope, then you break that connection between yourself and the eternal. He's lost hope of the expectation of the good. And he creates an end when there is no need for an end. In other words, this end it brings us back to the temporal world where there's an end. Eternity has no end. But when you break your connection with the eternal, you create an end point. I think that one can also despair when the only possibility is evil. For when good is no longer possible, all hope despairs. So it's not simply not having possibility, but when the only choice is evil, as we were talking earlier, I think this is a potential for despair as well. When there is no hope. In possibility, the eternal is continually near enough. It's always at hand, but far enough away that we can advance towards it. So possibility, the eternal is close through possibility. It's close enough to draw us towards it, but it's far enough away that we can't actually reach it. So the eternal draws us towards itself with that sense of possibility. But possibility can also be of fear. In despair, one dismisses possibility, and that's what makes it despair. He presumes the impossibility of the good. He says that the fearful person doesn't suppose the possibility of the good, but fears the possibility of the evil. He's kind of making a clear cut here, Luke. He's trying to say you're either in one or you're even in the other. I'm not so sure that life is that clear cut. I know it can be. It certainly can be. But sometimes we don't lose all hope, but we lose hope towards certain things and in certain things. And it brings us into a sense of despair, but not total despair. There was a word for total despair. Do you remember what the word is for total despair? Not ennui, but there's another one. Maybe it'll
total despair.
Yeah.
Are you talking about, you mean in Kierkegaard's vocabulary or just in general?
In general.
I could think of many.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's one I'm thinking of. I can't. It just doesn't come to mind. But it's a good word I like to use here now. But I can't.
Do you just mean like hopelessness or melancholy?
Yeah, total. Yeah, when a person comes to total hopelessness, there's a word for that. But that would be total hopelessness. But there's levels of it, like we were talking about eternity. There's levels of hopelessness where you may find hopelessness, like if you were sentenced to life imprisonment, there might be hopelessness that you'll ever see the light of day again. But you can still have hope of other kind, especially if you become a Christian in prison. So there's certain limits to this here that I just kind of wanted to bring up, that it doesn't necessarily have to refer to total hopelessness. But he gives us a warning here. And I think he's giving us a little bit of a sample of that partial hopelessness. He says, don't hope in man. Even a believer can sometimes lose faith. So we cannot and should not place all our hope in any man. But we also should not stop hoping for them, since they can always return and be saved. So he's giving us the limits and saying, yes, you don't want to put all your hope in an individual because they are fallible. They can let us down. But at the same time, we can never stop hoping for them because there's always the possibility that they can return and be saved. So he kind of speaking from both sides here. Our hope cannot be rooted in the one we're hoping for. It must be rooted in something higher. Perhaps he's pointing to the eternal here, or maybe even love itself. So our hope isn't in the individual. It has to be rooted in something higher. He says that no one can hope without loving, and that they're inseparable. The true lover hopes all things and does not give up on any man. For to give up hope is to give up love. So he equates hope and love together. That if you give up one, you give up the other.
I came up with two possible synonyms for hopelessness.
Okay.
That maybe go a step beyond hopelessness. So, I don't know. This might be too similar. Despondency.
Yeah.
That's probably not it. But I don't know of a level below the next one. Here we go. You ready?
Yeah.
Wretchedness.
Oh, no.
I don't think you can get lower than wretchedness.
No. Okay. I'll if I don't think of it now, I'll look it up offline and get back next week and tell you the word I'm thinking of. So sometimes people think that they possess their... Well, I talked about this here. Let me go back here. It says, the true lover hopes all things and does not give up on any man. For to give up hope is to give up love. But hope is a part of love, is it not? It's something that's subsumed in love. But if we lose hope, we don't lose all love. But we do lose part of it. And I think that's the distinction we have to make here. That if we lose hope, it doesn't necessarily mean that we give up all love. We just give up some of it. It diminishes love. Okay?
Well, let's think, I always like to bring in physical correlates of it, right?
Okay.
Let's say I have been heavily persecuted, and I've been thrown into solitary confinement because I've been framed for something, and there's no chance of me ever getting out. Right? I have no hope. I have no hope that I'll ever have a family, or having any physical projects, or learning anything. But I ought to be able to, even in a prison cell, I ought to be still able to have some sort of hope because of my relationship to the eternal, right?
Right.
So those hopes go away, but presumably, if the relationship with the eternal is correct, I'm not completely hopeless. But what does that look like? You don't have a chance to heal anyone. You don't have a chance to minister to anyone if you're in your solitary confinement. What does hope look like for the framed inmate or something of that nature? Or the castaway, the person who's on the deserted isle?
Okay. Well, when I experienced this, and the reason I brought it up is because this is one of my most unpleasant experiences. Certain failures or perception of failure in the temporal world, when we look at ourselves and we think we're a failure, it doesn't mean that we don't love other people, and it doesn't mean that we can't be giving to other people. It means that there's a certain despondency within us when it comes to the self. A certain sense that I didn't do everything that I could have done. I could have done better. I failed. But just like that expression I said, even if God should judge me to hell, I would say God was righteous in judging me to hell. That wouldn't affect me trying to help others out of hell. No, I felt that ambiguity where I felt that I failed. But at the same time, I felt love for others. So that even if I miss salvation, it doesn't stop me from helping others to achieve it. So that's kind of the paradoxical situation that I've been in. It's a very difficult situation. But it's not a total despondency. It's not like I've totally given up. It's just that it's partially that I've stopped hoping in myself. But it didn't affect the hope I have for others. Okay? So maybe that's a unique experience for me that other people have not had. But it's not a very happy place.
Yeah. But you're not really in hell.
Right.
Right. And you're not really on the desert island.
Right.
So
I think that we can have that sense of partial, what was the word he used? Despondency or despair. We can be in partial despair, but it'll affect our love, perhaps our self-love, but even then, I would say it doesn't have to affect our love for others. So if people are listening, and the reason I'm bringing it up, Luke, is because there may be people who watch this in the future that have a similar experience, and they think, I'm lost and I'm worthless. What's the sense? Well, that there is a sense. You still have an obligation to others. If you still love God, you still have to help others. You see what I mean? Maybe it's too difficult to explain.
Yeah, no. I completely agree. I'm just trying to think about it in terms of the castaway.
Okay.
The one who's... I'm taking it very literally.
Okay.
And someone who doesn't have the opportunity to help others, how they can still nurture their relationship to God so that they do have hope, even if they're totally cut off from all of society.
The hope would be to prepare for that shipwreck that lands on the island. To prepare for the future. Someday, maybe somebody is going to land on this island. Maybe there'll be somebody that I can talk to. So I'm going to prepare for that. I'm going to get ready for that person. I'm going to still prepare myself and use this opportunity to become a better individual.
So to still hold the possibility that one may be integrated into society again and to use it as a period of preparation.
Yes.
And that's how we maintain the hope. Okay. Someone will blast you out of the prison or the ship will come along.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. Sometimes people think that they possess their love as though it were like giving a gift of money to someone. If they stop giving it, the receiver of the money would be the one who loses out. And the giver benefits because he gets to keep his gift. So if I was like donating $100 a month to somebody and then they disappointed me, and so I said, well, I'm cutting you off now. I'm going to keep that $100 for myself. So you're the one who loses here, not me. That's the literal example that Kierkegaard is giving us here. But then he says, love is not like this. If one stops loving, it's the lover who loses out. So now I have to read page 240 to see if we get a little clarification on this here. Okay, he says this down drag is worldliness, the earthly passions of the unloving mind. For in itself, worldliness is heavy, ponderous, sluggish, slack, dispirited, dejected, and will not entertain the possible, least of all the possibility of the good, either for its own sake or for another's. So this is about the unloving mind. This is what happens in the unloving mind. this is what happens in worldliness. What earthly passions do to the unloving mind. And I'm trying to make when one gives up on a person as hopeless, he takes possibility away from him. He talks about those who are cowardly and that they do not have the courage to hope for anything. So let me go back here again, though, to make sure we cover this a little bit better. So about the giving of money, if you stop loving someone, who's the loser? Well, by not loving, you've broken your connection, even if it's a little bit, with the eternal. So who loses? The person being loved? Well, maybe he loses. But you lose also, because you are lessening the connection you have to eternity by removing the possibility of love with the individual. So I think that's the connection that he's trying to make here. Now, let me go to page 241. He said, there is a cowardly, fearful small-mindedness which does not have the courage to hope anything for itself. And this is what he's saying here, that it's cowardly not to hope. And I think we'll talk about it here in another quote from 241. There's a worldly vain mentality which would die of blushing and shame if it should, through the experience of making a mistake, of being fooled, of becoming a laughing stock, the most terrible of all horrors, by having hoped for another person something which was not fulfilled. So I think what he's saying is, but what about when you hope for something and it doesn't get fulfilled? Boy, that's a horror. I'm going to suffer from the world. I'm going to be making a mistake in front of the whole world. It's like praying for somebody and saying God has healed you, and then they come back and they're still limping. And they limp for years. Because you didn't believe in the possibility of the healing, you didn't pronounce it. You didn't want to pronounce it because you were a coward, because you were afraid of what would happen if it didn't come true. So that cowardliness stands in our way of the miraculous. Now, people say today, why aren't there more miracles? Well, maybe this is the reason. Maybe we're just too cowardly to put ourselves out there to pronounce a miracle. To put us.
I would say this. I would say this. If we can't see something, are we sure that it's not happening? Because what I would say, right, is that, many, many times we talk about it in the Bible, right? Yeah. There's such a thing as spiritual blindness, yeah. Right? And then suddenly people are able to see things. Mm-hmm. I even think about after Jesus appeared to his disciples, they didn't recognize him at first. And then, I don't know if he was in a different body or they just had some sort of block between them and him. Yeah. And then suddenly they were like, oh man, that is Jesus. Yeah. Part of me sometimes wonders if that's something that's going on. If there's just widespread spiritual blindness and we can't see the miraculous in our world. Another part of me wonders if there used to be a time when God was doing all sorts of miracles within the world and he just got sick of us continuing to backslide into apostasy and mess with all these idols, that he was just like, fine, have your idols. I'm going to disappear for a little while, see what happens. Yeah. Sometimes, or some combination of it all between. I have no idea what's scriptural or not, but these are some of my theories. When people are like, oh, there are no miracles, blah, 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 it's not scientific, I'm just like, I don't know. The scales came off my eyes this year, and I've seen some things that I never saw before, but maybe I'm a crazy person.
Yeah, you're not crazy, Luke. But there's it's difficult. The world of the miraculous is difficult. But I kind of blame us for it. I don't blame God for it. I think God wants to perform miracles for us. I think Christ performed miracles, and the early apostles performed miracles. And there's miracles that do happen. They may not always be seen, like you said. Maybe they're happening behind the scenery. They're not as open as they used to be.
Well, look. All right. Okay, today is August 22nd, 2017. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So something I see on social media right today is people were like, man, the solar eclipse yesterday was such a letdown. All that build-up and hype for nothing, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, are you freaking kidding me? You got to see a solar eclipse. Do you understand what had to happen in order to make that happen? People are like, well, it's just a bunch of rocks and gas getting in front of one another. It's a total cosmic coincidence. I'm just like, really, dude?
Yeah.
It's like, so did a miracle happen yesterday? Did something in the heavens happen yesterday?
Yeah.
Or did a big rock just go in front of a ball of gas?
Yeah. Well, you got a good point, Luke. I says maybe we've advanced a lot in science and medicine and so forth that we've produced.
Can I put your word "advance" in air quotes?
Okay. Yes. You can.
We've advanced so much in science. If you're watching this, I just put Bob's "advance" in air quotes.
But if we did advance so much, healing has become kind of the norm. We kind of go to the doctor and expect to be healed. So that might diminish the idea of healing in our reality a little bit. In those days and ages back, you got a sickness, you expected to have it maybe for the rest of your life. You got leprosy, you pretty much figured this is a done deal. You got, or you were crippled, you figured, okay, that's how I'm going to be for the rest of my life. Well, today, we're able to lift people out of those situations. So if somebody were to pray for somebody and they got healed, people would think, oh, it's just normal that people get healed, so it's not so much a miracle anymore. So sometimes the miracles are a lot more hidden, is what I'm trying to say. A lot more hidden in our world than they might have been if this was still ancient times.
Well, what I'm trying to say is, are they hidden or have we lost the discernment?
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say here is I think we may have lost the discernment.
Yeah.
As we've fallen away from the faith, our ability to see the miracles that are happening in front of us has been lost. Mm-hmm. And like I said, the sun got blotted out yesterday.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are complaining.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, kind of it was an inconvenience.
Yeah.
The person who has less love or has less of the eternal because they have less awareness of possibility. Where there is less possibility, there is less hope. So he's just making the connection between all of those. But the Christian wakes up renewing his hope in possibility. But why, I ask? Well, because his hope is in something higher. His hope is in the idea that the good will win in the end, but also that someone is watching over him. So I think we have an advantage as Christians, is that we have a hope that reaches the temporal in that God is watching over us, and the eternal is that the kingdom of heaven awaits us. So we have two things to hope on that bring us from the present into the eternal. He talks about misfortune. He compares paganism to Christianity in that they agree about misfortune in the world, but Christianity has an infinitely lower idea of misfortune and a more blessed conception of hope. So the idea here is that both the pagan and the Christian do suffer in this life, But the Christian does not consider such suffering to be of any major significance, since all things will turn out for good in the end. And it is his hope in the good that separates him from the pagan. So why is this so? Can the pagan also hope in the good? Perhaps his faith is not in the eternal, and so he is controlled by the temporal and the forces of this world. So I think when Kierkegaard speaks of pagans, he's speaking of religions of this world that put their foundation in the world. And there is really no eternal hope. And I think someplace he mentions that the pagan is the temporal, represents the temporal religion. And
do you think that's fair? Because I've been really interested in Egyptian religion lately, and I'm interested in all religions and mythologies and things like that. I'm kind of believing that going backwards is the way forwards now. But like the ancient Egyptians, right? In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they believed, I believe if your soul was lighter than a feather, then you got to progress to the next level or something like that. Don't quote me on it. I have to look that up. But, there are conceptions of something beyond temporality.
Yeah.
I mean, there were conceptions of underworlds and afterlives, and there are many pagans that believe in the afterlife. It's just there's so many different varieties, and like you said, permutations of paganism. It's hard to paint with a broad brush about what exactly paganism is. So I don't deny that there is a temporal component to it, and that it's ultimately based on blessings in this world and earning it and things of that nature.
Right,
but there does seem to be something that extends beyond this realm.
Yeah, we'd have to probably take each one separately to analyze it and see, because there are so many different ideas. And their understanding was a very physical projection of things. They would bury boats and slaves with the Pharaoh, so he would have boats to cross the river Styx, was it?
I think so, yeah.
And to get to the other side, very physical idea. Not necessarily that the Jews also didn't have somewhat a physical idea. It wasn't quite as physical. Again, we'd have to make some comparisons and see what the differences are. It didn't require so much faith. It didn't require a God who loved them. It didn't require a God who was righteous, a God who was holy. It was something that you could outsmart the gods. You could sneak in. You could do certain things. It was a projection of man, which people claim that, all religions are. I disagree with that. But the pagan religions, I think I can distinguish from my own knowledge as man projecting himself into his religion. So they became self-worship in one form or another.
Well, I think what you're indicating here is that most pagan religions involve a works sort of theology with them, right? And that ultimately it's based upon what man can do. But again, that's painting with a broad brush, and I don't know. I'm not necessarily sure we have to choose between projections and the real religion. I mean, I think there might be room in between where we have, as Christians, we might have to keep a very open mind that,
Well, I would say that I think that there were probably some people who were in the Egyptian belief system that somehow saw through it and were able to come to a higher level of understanding. And I like to use Melchizedek as that example, who was with the Canaanites, which were the dogs. They were the hated people. They were the defiled people. They sacrificed children to the Canaanites. They did all these horrible things. But you have Melchizedek rises up through that to worship the most God, Elyon, the high God, the God of the Most High. When Abraham meets him on the road, he tithes with him. He recognizes him as a priest of the Most High God.
Well, and then it said that Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
Right. So there, I think there we have evidence that one can rise above any religion and paganism if they want to. So
yeah, I mean, you see Paul doing the Sermon on Mars Hill, where he encounters the Greeks who have the tomb to the unknown God.
Right. So he says if there were no love, there would be no hope, either because love is also hope. When one hopes all things, it becomes difficult to grasp the object of hope. So if we hope everything, how do you create an object of hope out of that? It could mean that the lover hopes all things for himself, or he hopes all things for another. So I could be hopeful in my outcome in the world, what happens to me in eternity, or I could be filled with hope for what happens to other people in eternity. So it can go both ways, he says. But he says that they are really the same because their root is love, perhaps. At least that's my comment. Because the root of true hope is love. It includes yourself. You certainly don't hope that you go to hell and everybody else goes to heaven. You hope you go to heaven too, along with everybody else. So true love is inclusive of the self. To hope is to seek the good, and the good can be found in both the lover and the beloved. Blessed is the lover, for he hopes all things, and because he is a lover, he can learn from the eternal. Why? Because love is eternal, and love never ends, according to Paul. And that's how he ends that section in Corinth with love never ends. Where there are tongues, where there are knowledge, it passes away, but love never ends. So love is eternal. And that's what Kierkegaard is kind of holding on to here. Then he talks about shame. Now he finally gets back to shame. He opened up this topic way back in the beginning, and now he finally gets to it. Love hopes all things, but can never be brought to shame. We think that he could be disappointed when the beloved does not fulfill his hope. But does that bring about shame? The world considers cleverness as something desirable and honorable, but he says that it's contemptuous. Men don't learn to scorn the clever, in the world anyway, but cleverness is something to conquer through Christianity. So I had to think about this a little bit here. Why is he down on cleverness? All of a sudden things, he's got a problem with being clever. Acting cleverly is similar to bearing false witness, he even says, against the eternal. It's a compromise.
This is my favorite part of the whole reading. I love this.
He says it's a compromise. It wins the world's favor and honor. Perhaps he's speaking more about craftiness and slyness here.
Well, I think what he's talking about, if I remember this correctly, because it really resonated with me. Let me see if I can try to remember this. But it's to become obsessed with your own understanding, right? And so that you go off and you build all these like crazy philosophical systems like Hegel did or whatnot. Yeah. And you try to explain all the secrets of the universe.
Yeah.
And like you feel like you don't need the humility of the gospel to bring you down to the good old fear of the Lord that'll be the true foundation of wisdom. You believe too much in your own intellect. And I was just like, yes.
Yeah.
As someone who it's been shown knew nothing, yeah. Right? As a result of his cleverness, I was like, this was my favorite part of the reading.
So it's not by works or by cleverness, right?
Right,
that
right,
we inherit
right.
the kingdom. That's good. We should add that. So the Holy Scriptures tell us not to go far in the world and warn us. They warn us against it and want us to keep unspotted from the world. So cleverness, just like you said, can bring us to that point of self-adornment, self-worship, so to speak, self-idolatry, where we become so clever that we don't need God, we don't need Christ.
And one day, if you just keep walking up the steps, you get your bachelor's degree, and then your master's degree, and then your enlightened PhD degree, and then you get to wear the robe, and they get to put a little hexagon on your head and turn a tassel and maybe you get to carry a scepter one day. Can you believe that, Bob? Maybe one day you too can carry a scepter because you know things.
Okay, Luke, would you do me a favor since we're friends? Would you teach me the secret handshake?
Oh, I'd love to, Bob. I'd love to. But I'll tell you this, it's not real.
No. But you know what it is? It's a different, what did we call it? A different disguise of Gnosticism. It's academic Gnosticism.
Oh.
Right?
All the rituals, all the symbols, and no one has any idea what's going on.
Only our listeners. Only our listeners.
And I'm being vague about it.
Okay, the object of our hope now is the concern. So we have to consider what one hopes for when hope isn't fulfilled. So what if hope isn't fulfilled? He says, well, consider the object of hope. We can see it in the bitterness of the one who hopes because they were attached to that which they hoped for. So if you don't get what you hope for, it can make you very bitter. So 244, skipping ahead here, getting near the end. He says, yet if one hopes for something for which it is a shame to hope, regardless of whether it is fulfilled or not, one really does not hope. It's a misuse of the noble word hope to bring it into relationship with something like this, for the hope is essentially and internally related to the good. Therefore, one can never be put to shame by hoping. So if we hope for the good, we can never be put to shame. Why? The good is eternal. But if you hope in something less than the eternal, watch out, is kind of what he's saying, because you're vulnerable. You can be put to shame by hoping for an earthly fortune, especially if it doesn't materialize. The shame isn't in the fact that it was unsuccessful, but rather that it was hoped for in the first place. It's like praying for the new Cadillac, or the new Lexus, and I didn't get my prayer answered. Man, I guess God isn't really there. Well, consider what you're praying for. Related to Jesus when he says in Matthew 6:21, where the treasure is, there will the heart be also. So a little bit of self-examination. Examine your treasures because that's who you really are. It isn't really hope when you hope such things. It's really a desire, a craving, and expecting. One can also be put to shame for hoping evil come upon another person when things turn out well for them. So if you're hoping evil comes to a person and they profit, you can suffer shame because you wanted evil. But it's not shame because they didn't suffer evil. It's shame because you wanted them to suffer evil. The shame falls on you. Because it wasn't hope, he says it's vengeance and hatred. When our hope is for another, couldn't that person let us down, and wouldn't that bring shame to us? So he brings up the prodigal son, and he says, it was the son who bore the shame, not the father, for it's impossible for the one who's shamed to be put to shame. In other words, the focus is upon the error of the son and the father for loving him, and not the father for loving him. So the error was in the son for leaving the father, for bringing shame to himself, not in the father for loving him and continuing to love him. So I think maybe people need to reread that little parable there.
If you want a dramatized version of that, I recently. I don't, Bob, are you familiar with the 1977 movie Jesus of Nazareth? The guy that played Jesus in that, I forget his name, but he's absolutely awesome. He's kind of he's a British actor, but he tells the parable of the prodigal son, and it'll if you're not crying by the end of it. So it's on YouTube. You can check it out.
Oh, is it? Okay. What's on
like
YouTube? How do you look it up on YouTube for the?
Just type in Prodigal Son, Jesus of Nazareth, 1977, and you'll get it's like an 8-minute clip or an 11-minute clip but the whole movie is on YouTube, and it's like 6.5 hours long. I haven't watched the whole thing. I watch it in little snippets here and there. But as far as dramatizations of the New Testament go, it's been one of the better ones I've encountered. I really like the guy that played Jesus there.
Oh, thank you. I will check it out. I may have seen it or at least seen parts of it, but I will check out that part.
Yeah.
Thank you. It says the eternal has the eternal concept of honor and shame. It's not vain and not clever. It's not the result that determines the honor and the shame, but the expectation of it. So honor always belongs to the lover, because the lover loves, and love is eternal. So this connection is paramount in understanding Kierkegaard here. There's only one mistake, Luke, that a person can make. One mistake in eternity that you can make. And that's to have envious and hateful expectations, to be excluded from blessedness. So in our expectations, it's our expectations that exclude us rather than our disappointments. And we lose the blessings of the eternal simply because we reject them. And so that's where we can conclude for today.
Right on, Bob. Good job. I was just going to add that the Jesus of Nazareth, this is according to Wikipedia, is a 1977 British-Italian television miniseries directed by Franco Zeffirelli and co-written by Zeffirelli, Anthony Burgess, and Suso, something Italian, which dramatizes... it's a big deal. Let's check it out. And I think the guy that plays Jesus, his name is Robert Powell.
Okay.
And what's interesting, Michael York plays John the Baptist, and Michael York was, I believe, Basil in the Austin Power movies. Oh, check this out. Ernest Borgnine's in it, too.
Yeah, he kind of sneaks into some of these religious movies for some reason.
Yeah, good old... Yeah, so if you need your Ernest Borgnine fix, you'll get it with Jesus of Nazareth. I forget what role he has. That's funny.
Yeah. I think I may have seen that then, because I think I remember him being in one of those movies.
Well, it's good. It's good. It's well done. It's well done. Okay. Thanks, Bob. That was good. That was good teaching.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your comments and your participation.
Kind of a crazy discussion today, but hey, I think we've given people a lot of things to research if they want to follow the breadcrumb trail.
I think so.
Yeah. All right. Download Noetic app if anyone's still listening.
Oh, and don't forget to send questions and comments to us, please.
Yeah. philosophyluke@gmail.com. And what's your contact information, Bob?
Oh, well, they can just comment on that. They can send me email at rshut@sbcglobal.net if they like.
Okay. Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.